Hello everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the 1920s, and here are the corresponding page numbers, subject headings, and political key terms from American Yop. I'll also leave a note in the cards to the online version. In addition to these two political key terms, we'll also be talking about a few economic and cultural concepts. So here are the key questions that we want to answer in these two videos, so feel free to pause and write them down. Let's launch right into the politics. In the 1920s, all three US presidents were Republicans. We're only going to be looking at the first two in this video. We will look at Herbert Hoover when we talk about the beginning of the Great Depression, so stay tuned for those videos. The Republican Party also controlled both the House of Representatives and the Senate during the entire decade. So what we see is that these two presidents, these two first presidents at least, are able to accomplish most of their political agenda. And we should consider two questions here. The first is, how were Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge's domestic and foreign policies trying to bring the United States away from the World War I mentality? The second question is, what were some of the problems that marred their presidencies? As far as foreign policy is concerned, Harding opposed the United States joining the League of Nations. Not super surprising, because Wilson, the main proponent of the U.S. joining the League of Nations, was the opposite party. He's a Democrat. And also, the Harding administration worked to promote the disarmament of countries that were involved in World War I. And the Republicans passed a tariff to discourage imports and encourage American industrial production. So you're also seeing sort of like an isolationist economic approach here. The Republican presidents in the 1920s do work to appease European interests, largely by providing them with economic aid. And I'll try to remember to leave a note in the cards to some of my old AP Euro videos that get into these concepts with more detail if you're interested. But just be forewarned, those videos were recorded like 7 years ago and the audio quality is really bad. And I have terrible allergies back then because I lived on the East Coast and I was coughing and clearing my throat a lot. Anyway, as far as immigration policy was concerned, nativism returns with a vengeance. We looked at nativism prior to the Civil War, and what you're going to see in the 1920s was a set of immigration laws that set quotas. And what these quotas do is that they limit people of certain ethnicities from immigrating to the United States. In particular, these laws targeted Eastern European immigrants and Asian immigrants. There also are many scandals associated with Warren Harding's presidency. The first one was let's just talk about the Teapot Dome scandal. But before we get into that, just generally, Warren Harding was seen as a very corrupt U.S. president. He had multiple mistresses and illegitimate children. In fact, when he ran for office in 1920, if I'm not mistaken, he had a pregnant mistress, and it was fairly widely known. And he voted for prohibition as a politician, but he kept the White House stocked with whiskey. So the politician was certainly separate from the person in that regard. Most of Warren's cabinet members were personal and close friends of his, and they were nicknamed the Ohio Gang because Harding was from Ohio. So you kind of see a return to that Andrew Jackson spoil system thing there. And the Teapot Dome scandal concerned Harding's Secretary of the Interior. His name was Albert Fall. And what Fall did was he accepted bribes from railroad companies, which then ultimately led to Fall giving drilling rights to these railroad companies on government-owned oil fields in Wyoming. Harding was not directly involved in this scandal, but still, because Albert Fall was his cabinet member, it did reflect poorly upon Harding's judgment. Harding died suddenly of a heart attack in August of 1923, and Calvin Coolidge took his place. And Coolidge embraced free market laissez-faire economics, just like Harding did. He said, quote, "The chief business of the American people is business," end quote. So you kind of get a sense of his general economic philosophy there. And Coolidge also supported moving away from government regulation of the economy. That's literally what laissez-faire economics is. Think about how this represents a breakaway from the progressive era. As far as what we can predict here is, how will this affect the government's handling of the economy when the Great Depression strikes in 1929? That non interventionist economic approach, is that going to come back and bite the United States, right? Coolidge also agrees to something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and that was a pledge by 15 different nations to avoid going to war. And the United States still returned to this isolationist approach, like we just discussed with Harding. And the United States, interestingly, did spend $250 million still on new battleships. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact, by the way, was not really enforced. How feasible really was it for all these global powers to just agree not to go back to war, particularly after the agreements of the Treaty of Versailles, right? Germany was held so liable for World War One that it's kind of hard for us in retrospect to think that Germany's just going to completely agree to be permanently demilitarized. I forget if I mentioned this, by the way, but I will leave a link to old AP Euro videos or a playlist or something somewhere just so you can have that. Anyway, Coolidge chose not to run for re-election in 1928. Hoover was also a Republican, and he continues those economic and isolationist policies. And again, we'll get back to Hoover soon. None of these three U.S. presidents prioritized social reforms, but a handful of the remaining progressive accomplishments do take place in the early 1920s. So first, the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment, was ratified in 1920, and that was seen as a crowning achievement of the temperance movement that was led mainly by Protestant reformers who blamed alcohol consumption on many of the nation's problems like poverty and crime. Next, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, and of course, that granted women the right to vote. And there was also a push, or at least an introduction, of an Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. That was initially proposed in the 1920s, but it was never ratified. In fact, it remains unratified to this day, and I'm recording this video in March of 2022. So over 100 years and still no Equal Rights Amendment. Further, I should add that it's Women's History Month right now. Anyway, let's talk about the economy a little bit. In the 1920s, you see a general economic trend of growth, right? At least in the urban sector. And America's economy's general focus here was producing consumer goods. This is fueled by an increasingly modernized form of production. Successful corporations start to work to integrate their production and distribution. They try to diversify the products that they're selling, and they're also trying to expand industrial research while also attempting to gain control of entire industries, right? Ultimately, monopolies. Think about how in the progressive era there was this massive federal effort to try to take down trusts, and we go sort of right back to that. But in this decade, what we're seeing are what we call oligopolies. Those are sort of like almost monopolies, I guess. You'll see just a handful of companies owning the vast majority of production of that kind of business instead of just one. Hopefully that makes sense. Also, in general, you're seeing this notion of welfare capitalism to improve worker morale and reduce the challenges of unions. And what I mean by welfare capitalism is that businesses were sort of meant to take control of the well-being of their workers, right? These businesses were meant to provide some sort of benefits. They were supposed to promote open shop employment in which non-union workers receive the same benefits as union workers. And that was actually a strategy that was meant to undercut the influence of labor unions. And union membership does actually rapidly decline in the 1920s. The Supreme Court also takes a pro-business stance. So welfare capitalism is not really something that favors the workers. It's just meant to generally appease the workers so that these large industries can continue to grow ultimately. This is just an interesting graph of the GNP per capita, so feel free to analyze that a little bit. And again, Continuing on with the economy, let's look at automobiles, right? The 1920s was often referred to as the age of the automobile. It was the symbol of the rise of the consumer economy. Automobile production tripled in the 1920s from 1.5 to 4.5 million automobiles, I think, produced overall. Just double check, fact check that. Is that 4.5 million per year? I want to say it's for the whole decade. Could be wrong. I'm looking at old notes here. By 1925, assembly line production at Henry Ford's Highland Park plant completed a car every 10 seconds. And the United States made about 85% of all the world's automobiles in 1920. And let's just use Ford as an example. So, Ford workers were paid more than the going rate. And what this did was this reduced turnover while also enabling these workers to not only produce these cars, but also be able to purchase them, particularly the Model T, which was the standard model of car, nothing super fancy, sort of like the 1920s version of the Ford Focus. And that car, the price point there was low enough that again, the workers, the people who were building that car, they could afford to buy it. And you also saw in Ford a significant number of African American workers at this plant, so more diverse, and it also will help us further understand the Great Migration. And we did mention that in the previous video, and the Great Migration was really like a massive wave of migration. In fact, there are two waves. There's another one during the World War II era, and that Ford model, again, it entailed mass production. In order to produce a car that quickly, you needed to have some sort of assembly line production. And Henry Ford really championed that. The Model T cost approximately $300, which was equivalent to 3 months' wages at the time. And adjusted for inflation, $300 is worth about $4,200 today. And General Motors' strategy of diversifying auto lines, again, it was a little bit unique in the sense that there were different models created to target different consumers. So they had luxury cars and also just standard cars. And of course, now many corporations copy this model. And the auto industry also spurs new production of, or rather, the tapping of many really crucial natural resources. So steel, rubber, and glass and petroleum. I know steel's not a natural resource, but it's created from one. And also road building, of course. If we see more cars, we need more roads. So you're going to see commercial development of highways, and that also promotes the springing up of new businesses, and it also changes social habits and spending habits. This enables people to rapidly move to the suburbs. And it also allows for the fast-paced growth of cities, both horizontally and vertically. And when I mean that, I mean literally. You're going to see new buildings start to reshape skylines, so skyscrapers. And Houston is a good example of horizontal growth. It was a city that really did not, at least rapidly, develop until after mass auto production. So you're going to see that it's kind of more like suburban sprawl in a city like Houston. And also, Houston grew pretty rapidly because of its oil refining industry. And it's an example of an early Sun Belt city. We'll talk about the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt later, really more in the post-World War II era. Okay, just really quickly here, in addition to automobiles, Americans in the 1920s began to produce way more household items, and they're also more affordable because of newly available lines of credit. So what I mean by that is that instead of paying for something all at once, consumers could pay a small down payment and then they could pay the remaining balance in monthly installments with interest. We still do this all the time, right? If you buy a car, most of us can't just afford to pay for a car in cash. So instead, we pay a little bit and then we make monthly payments after that. American spending on household appliances actually increased by more than 120% in the 1920s. And again, purchasing is easier for folks who may not necessarily have access to a brick and mortar store. You start to see the advent of mail order catalogs and also, if you can go to the store, department stores. And again, we'll see even more of that in the post-World War II era. My bad, I didn't see that. Okay, you probably have heard of this decade referred to as the Roaring Twenties, but I want to take a second to critique that. Not all of the United States is booming in the 1920s. In particular, we're not doing so well in rural America during this time. many workers and farmers did suffer despite this general pattern of economic growth. The golden age for farmers was earlier. It was more like in the 19 teens, specifically during World War I itself. And that was because the United States acted as a breadbasket for Europe. Trench warfare destroyed European agriculture, at least where the fighting was taking place. But after the war was over, the demand for such rapid agricultural production was lower again. And what this does is it of course makes prices drop, and it makes it so that farmers are unable to pay their mortgages, and that's going to lead to a litany of problems. Um, there's also a growing gap between farm and non-farm income. Generally, farmers' wages are not increasing. And part of that is again because the price of their goods is dropping. And the South does not have a particularly diverse form of agricultural production. In fact, they still largely they relied on cotton. And that's a cash crop. That's not a subsistence crop, of course. And citrus, dairy, and the wheat industry, they continue to profit actually in the 1920s. But again, you're going to start to see a rapid decline. And you're also going to see a lot of environmental problems in the late 20s and early 30s that will continue to devastate agriculture. We'll talk about that more in our videos on the Great Depression. There's also an increase in tenant farming. So people that don't actually own the land, they're just working on it. They're leasing out a little bit of land and ultimately paying off their landlord either with a share of their crop. That's literally what sharecropping is. Or also they might be paying them in cash in some way. And so because of this, many people actually leave farming altogether and they relocate, especially to cities where there are more jobs that often pay more. And other industries that are weak during this time are the coal mining industry. They're facing lots of competition from the oil and natural gas industry. And so coal miners witness a decrease in their pay and a decrease in the number of jobs available to them in the first place. You actually see many coal mines, especially in the West, are abandoned during this time. And that leads to ghost towns throughout the American West. And in railroads, actually, you start to see stiff competition because, again, this is the age of the automobile. And so trains are less in demand, and cars are the wave of the future as far as the United States is concerned, right? And the New England textile industry also struggles in the 1920s. They're facing low-wage Southern counterparts. During the era of Reconstruction, there was this attempt for the United States to try to diversify its economy in the South. It wasn't overly successful. Again, as I just said, largely the South is still very much a cotton-centered economy, but nonetheless, there was enough industrialization, particularly in the textile realm, because again, there's cotton there, so it actually lowers the cost of production to have the factories right there as well. That's a big problem for New England. So oftentimes, former textile workers in New England are also going to seek employment elsewhere. As far as culture is concerned, this is really the age of the motion picture. So mass communication just generally reshapes American culture. And you see this soaring of movie ticket sales in the 1920s. Hollywood studios are dominating the entertainment industry at this point. There's this general sense of elegance when Americans think about movie stars and just the glamour of Hollywood. And many movie companies were actually founded by Europeans, or at least the descendants of recent European immigrants. And so they were sort of seen as in tune with developing and changing commercial tastes. There was sort of this sense that cities like London and Paris were a little bit ahead culture and fashion wise. And so that made, again, the movie industry very appealing. And you do see some backlash here. Conservative groups do attack the Hollywood industry for just generally the culture that they represent. Maybe they believe that there was really open sexual expression, and studios would respond actually with their own plans. Sometimes they kind of back things down, they'd self-censor a little bit, but still generally the Hollywood industry was seen as maybe more progressive than the politics of the time. This is also the age of the radio. So Radios already existed, of course, but they were more of a military technology. But after World War One, they are very much a household item. Large companies form national networks that air a variety of programs to homes across the country. So we're actually talking about shows. Yes, they broadcast the news, but many American families actually literally tuned into the radio for their entertainment. And most likely, I think the most famous show I think of off the top of my head was the Amos and Andy show. But there's some major problems with that show. I encourage, if you're doing research on the 20s, to look into them further. Because ultimately, they're kind of like a radio version of blackface minstrelsy. And we'll talk about blackface minstrelsy a little bit more when we get into some specific examples of movies. And the radio further helped commercialize previously isolated forms of music. And it's also going to build a mass following for sports because people, of course, listen to sports competitions through the radio. You see, again, we talked about newspapers prior to the Spanish American War when we discussed yellow journalism. You're going to see, again, a growth of the newspaper industry. So, really, some of this is also all tied into growth and consumption. You see that tabloids become very popular. And of course, tabloids, they're like those magazines that you see when you're waiting in line in the grocery store. They emphasize crime and sex scandals and gossip and sometimes things like sports and politics and culture. But people want to buy them, right? So because they're so popular, they force advertisers to appeal to the audience that is really attracted to reading articles like that, right? So they're actually, this is more of a thing in the Cold War after World War II, but you also see the growth of literally an advertising industry. So that's also a new economic opportunity for people. And journalism, the industry generally also starts to consolidate. I talked about oligopolies earlier when I was talking about just the general kind of business practice of the 1920s. So not monopolies, but a bunch of large corporations that all ultimately control a major industry. I forget if I think I mentioned William Randolph Hearst earlier when we were talking about the Progressive era. He has a chain of newspapers, and ultimately William Randolph Hearst controlled about 14% of all of the nation's circulation of newspapers. So of course Hearst was a very, very, very rich man. I already talked about the growth of advertising. I guess a couple more interesting details here because I have them in my notes. There literally was market research and psychological research to kind of determine what the consumer wanted. They looked more into like behavior, desires, and anxieties rather than the actual qualities of the products that they were advertising. And further, the advertising industry generally just wanted to celebrate consumption as a positive good, not a waste. They were literally trying to convince people that they needed to buy something, even if it was completely unnecessary. Be prepared for a GIF as we talk about music. So that dance up there, that's the Charleston, which literally looks impossible. I mean, I can't even do the floss, and I'm looking at this and I'm terrified. Anyway, music. And also, of course, dance. So the recording industry is also very much in its nebulous phase. I mean, the music, recording, again, the technology's here, right? So you see that it transforms American mass and regional pop culture. There are dance crazes. Again, that's the Charleston. There's also the foxtrot, the tango, the waltz. And so, of course, the musicians need to record these albums and sell them like hotcakes. So this is also really important to, when considering American race relations at the time. There are some very, very prominent and just classic African-American musicians during this time period. Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, who's pictured below. I'll try to remember to leave a link to this song that she sings here, Deep Moaning Blues. And it's interesting because of the way that these recording industries actually label these different music genres. We still think about some of these categories today, right? Like if you're kind of a big fan of maybe 50s and 60s music, you might know about like soul music or rhythm and blues music that generally is associated with African American musicians. Ma Rainey was given the name the Mother of the Blues Bessie Smith was given the name the Empress of the Blues. And then also, of course, who can forget Louis Armstrong, the famous jazz musician? And also, I would just make the case that generally blues music, really throughout all of American history, but definitely in the 1920s, was a genre that, again, largely was oriented around black musicians. Okay, sports. I would say that really the most prominent American pastime in the 1920s was baseball. There was an unprecedented popularity of spectator sports. Athletes, just like movie stars, they take on celebrity status. Babe Ruth obviously comes to mind. His home run hitting and just his appetite for publicity. He loved to be on TV. He loved to be interviewed, right? Or not TV. I guess he loved to be interviewed by the radio. Anyway, he helped restore baseball's tarnished image after the 1919 Black Sox scandal. And what that was that the Chicago White Sox purposely lost the World Series in 1919. And the reason why was because of gambling. And so that's why it was nicknamed the Black Sox scandal, because it was seen as like, kind of this dark, shady deal. And attendance soared in baseball generally. And part of it was because someone like Babe Ruth, people wanted to pay to watch this outstanding athlete. Newspapers, radio stations, again, they broaden their audience, but this is a segregated sport. Black baseball players and Latinx baseball players, they were completely excluded from Major League Baseball unless they could pass as white. And there were baseball leagues that were founded for black athletes, and this is organized in the 1920s. And it's worth noting that prior to the late 19th century, kind of like the 1880s, actually some sports leagues, including baseball, were integrated by race. So in the Reconstruction years, there was racial progress in sports, but then after the end and the failure of Reconstruction and the return of white supremacist governments, we see the resegregation of sports. Okay, that's gonna wrap us up for today. Sorry, this video was a little bit long and I kind of got a little bit too conversational here, but it's just really interesting to talk about culture, talk about economics. We're gonna actually get even deeper into some of this stuff, so why don't we stop and we'll pick back up with more 1920s content soon. Thanks for watching. Take care.